Hi, I'm John Snow. I'm a Tree Risk Assessment Qualified, ISA, Board Certified Master Arborist. I own Tree CheckUp, which is a consulting firm that services the Southeast, including South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Also, I'm the founder of Tree CheckUp Pro, which is an online community for arborists. I'd like to thank the Georgia Arborists Association for having me today to talk about Palms4U, understanding palms and proper palm pruning. In today's agenda, we're going to talk about what are palms, then we'll go into working with palms, and finally wrap it up with problems that you may encounter with palms. And then we'll open that up to a questions and answers. Okay, so let's start out by talking about what are palms. So palms are a monocot compared to trees, which are dicots. So in other words, palms are more closely related to a grass than they are to trees. There's approximately 2,600 species worldwide, consisting of 181 different genera. And most of these are tropical, subtropical, and found in warm temperate climates. There are also 14 native species of palms to the United States, which is pretty interesting. On this next slide, you can see here the approximate range of palms. Most of your palms are not cold hardy, and therefore you're going to find them in your warm, more temperate climates like mid and lower Florida. We see many different varieties of palms down there, including your coconut palms and your royal palm and queen palms and such. As we get further north, closer to the coastal areas, we see a lot of cabbage palms, saw palmetto, some needle palms, jelly palms or pindo palm, as well as our Washingtonia palms. Those are quite common in a lot of our coastal areas going all the way up to Charleston. Up in the Atlanta area, I don't think that there's too many palms in that area. For the most part, that area is a little too far north and a little too cold for most of the palms to survive. On occasion, we'll see some date palms here and there. When I was working in the Hilton Head area, I know for a fact that there's a number of large date palms, but that's truthfully a little far for their normal range, and they become very susceptible to cold damage at that point. Typically, we would see a lot of cold damage on the Washingtonias in that area, and that would typically result in the palms needing to be pruned more frequently due to the result of the fronds dying from the cold damage. Typically, your Washingtonias will recover, your date palms will recover. I know one area in the Hilton Head area, pretty funny, they kept replanting queen palms year after year after year until they finally realized that the Hilton Head area, even though it's fairly temperate, it's still too cold for queen palms to actually survive. And so they ended up finally replacing those with some cabbage palms, your regular sable palmetto, which also happens to be the state tree of South Carolina, and ended up replacing those with that. So if you're going to be working with clients that insist on installing palms, one of the most important things to do is to check the cold hardiness of the palm, particularly the further north and further away from the coast that you are in Georgia or South Carolina. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about palm morphology. As you can see in this illustration here, I've taken this from the Florida Grades and Standards for Nursery Plants from 2015. That standard is going to be updated very soon, but I would definitely recommend, particularly if you're in southern Georgia, go ahead and getting a copy of this book, because it can be very informative and really help give you some direction as far as what is out there for the nurseries and what the recommendations are for transplanting them and also grading the palms. That's a very important thing. So as you can see here, you have what they're defining as clear wood or gray wood, which is the trunk of the tree. And then you have what they call this crown shaft. So some palm species actually have what's called a crown shaft, like your royal palm is a pretty good example of that, with a pretty well-developed actual crown shaft. But then you have other palms like your Washingtonia palm and your cabbage palm, which are found in Georgia, that don't have that defined crown shaft. Typically, palms that do have a crown shaft are self-pruning and don't necessarily need to be pruned. The ones that do not have a crown shaft, like your Sago Palm and Washingtonias, are the ones that actually require that pruning. Next, we can see here, some of the different types of leaves. We have a palmate palm leaf, which is what you would see with a Washingtonia palm or a cabbage palm. We also have coastal palmate palm leaves, and then our pinnate palm leaves. Now, our pinnate palm leaves, you'll see those on like your date palms and trees like that. Okay, next I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the uses for palm trees. Palms have been in existence for millions of years, and man has utilized them for thousands of years, since biblical times. Back in the days of Jesus, there's writings in the Bible talking about the uses of palms in both the Old and the New Testament. And in fact, one of the species of palms native to that area, the Judean date palm, actually went extinct. But scientists found some seeds from almost 2,000 years ago in Masada, and have actually been able to revive those and get some seedlings to come up from those. So that's a species of extinct palm that has actually been revived due to some very careful science. So that's pretty interesting. But some of the other uses of palms, we have carnauba wax, we have palm oils, we have people eat palm hearts, obviously we have coconuts, many other different kinds of things. Sometimes you'll even see a lot of medicinal uses, like the saw palmetto is pretty popular and common, although there's a lot of research still being done on that. So we see many different uses for palms. In fact, some palm fronds are actually used for thatching roofs. Some of the old Civil War forts were actually constructed from palm logs, and that proved to be very effective against the Union Army and such. So there's some very interesting use cases for it. Well, I'd like to tell you a little story. When I was working in the Hilton Head area, we'd go down and visit Savannah, and a lot of the local crafters there would actually make palm roses by folding the palm leaves and everything, which is pretty interesting. They charge $5 or $10 for a palm rose, which could last basically forever. It's pretty interesting. So in our landscapes, we see palms used particularly here in Florida, but along the coastal areas of Georgia and South Carolina. Palms are a very common planting in people's landscapes. Unfortunately, many of the municipalities actually view palm trees as being substandard. They don't really necessarily categorize them as a tree. So for example, An oak may be a Category 1 tree, yet a palm tree is going to be a Category 3 tree. So for every oak, you basically need 4 palms to be the equivalent of that. And that's a little bit of a mistake in my view, simply from the fact that depending on the location, palms can actually be a very nice, valuable asset to a community or a property. So I think that that's something that should probably be reevaluated, and palms should become a little bit more accepted within the municipalities. Obviously, palm trees provide plenty of habitat for wildlife. A funny story, when I first got down to Hilton Head, probably within 2 months, I was out on a property with a client and my foreman, and we were doing a job site inspection, reviewing the work that needed to be done, which basically consisted of pruning about 20 palms on the property and pruning supply of oaks. I hear this noise from this palm tree, kind of the squeak, 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 squeak noise, and we're looking around, and I look up in the palm tree and I see something come flying out and hit the ground. And so we walk over, and it turned out that there was a rat that was in the palm, and a rat snake had actually gotten this rat. Now, how a rat snake can get 30 feet up a palm tree to catch a rat is beyond me. And it was a pretty big snake. So I've seen, over the years, I've seen snakes, bats, birds like this owl, spiders, ants, you name it, go in palm trees and nest in there. And this is actually one of the reasons why in a landscape it's important to prune and maintain the palm trees. If you're removing a lot of the dead fronds, not over pruning them, but removing the dead fronds and removing the seed pods, you're actually going to reduce a lot of the insect and animals that could actually get into that and create some problems. There's been many instances over the years that I've seen with clients in Hilton Head where the palm tree was planted too close to the home and it was touching or within 5 feet of the home, and raccoons, rats, whatever, squirrels were actually getting into the onto the roof and into the home, causing damage. So it's very important to make sure that proper pruning is done to maintain the palms away from homes and to help minimize potential wildlife. As we get away from the home, obviously, we can leave more open habitat for these little critters to create their homes and live in. I think that that's an important thing as well. So what is not a palm? One species is a cycad, and that's the Sago Palm, which is very commonly planted here in the southeast. That's Cycas revoluta, and that's actually native to the Orient, Japan, and that area. And the interesting thing about Sago palms, they're a gymnosperm, but they're not a palm. One of the important things that many people are very unaware of is the fact that these plants are actually very poisonous. The seeds from the female Sago palm can get dispersed in the ground, and even after you remove it, if the seeds are still there, animals can dig and eat that and get sick and actually die. I once had a client that unfortunately their pet ate a Sago palm and died. So something to be aware of. Your Sago palm, even though it's called a palm, is not actually a palm. So next we're going to talk about working with palms and what you need to know. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to look at our standards. We have the Z133 standard and our best management practices. In the Z133 standard, it says very clearly, palm frond skirts should be removed from the top down. This is in part 8.3.8. And it also says, arborists performing this work while climbing shall be supported by an arborist climbing system and when possible, positioned above the skirt. This is very important. One of the leading causes of palm fatalities in our industry related to palms is when the skirt of the palm actually comes down and crushes the climber and causes asphyxiation. They're basically suffocated to death underneath the weight of all these palm fronds. A lot of people don't understand palms don't look like they weigh a whole lot, but the reality of it is they weigh a tremendous amount. And when you have 30 or 40, 50 dead palm fronds coming down on top of you and crushing you and pinning you against that tree, the palm trunk, that can definitely cause some serious amount of damage and result in potentially death. We see this oftentimes out in California and in areas of Florida, typically on the coastal areas of Georgia, South Carolina. We don't see that issue so much because typically the palms don't get quite as large nor as full. But again, one of the things that we need to understand here is the arborists shall be supported by an arborist climbing system. Oftentimes, in what I've seen over the years in production climbing is basically the climbers are just spiking up the palm and removing the dead fronds and a bunch of live fronds. A very quick and efficient way of working, but it's definitely not the most professional, nor is it according to the Z133 standards. If you were going to be properly tied in, you'd probably want to use either a basal anchor with a SRT system or use a bucket truck or an compact aerial lift. So the Z133 standard further says, arborists should not remove palm skirts by positioning themselves below the frond skirt or between the palm skirt and the trunk of the tree. And this goes to what I've just said about the palm fronds, particularly in California and Florida, even Texas, where we have these larger palms that the skirts can actually collapse on you. Most notably, Washingtonia robusta, the Washingtonia palm, is probably one of the worst ones when it comes to this. The fronds are actually fairly loosely attached to the palm itself, and so if the climber goes up underneath and is trimming and everything, those fronds can actually break away and collapse on top of the climber. Let's talk about the BMPs. Palm pruning is the removal of fronds, flowers, fruit, stems, or loose petioles that may pose a danger to structures, climbers, electrical facilities, and people nearby. Now, it's interesting, the BMP really only has about one page devoted to palms, and the Z133, in fact, only has a small paragraph. So, palm pruning is the removal of fronds, flowers, fruit, and stems, or loose petioles. Palms can also be pruned for aesthetic reasons to eliminate basal sprouts, dead fronds, and seed pods. The key here is that live, healthy fronds should not be removed except when necessary to provide clearance. So many times we see palm trees that are over pruned. Classically, we call it hurricane pruning. And as you can see, here's an example of hurricane pruned palms. and what that kind of looks like. Your palm fronds are supposed to be removed to a horizontal level. So the BMP says if live healthy fronds must be removed, avoid removing those that initiate above horizontal. And then fronds to be removed should be close to the petiole base without damaging living trunk tissue. Removing dead petiole bases by cutting into live tissue, a procedure called shaving, skinning, peeling, or sanding, is not an acceptable practice because it often allows the entry of disease that will shorten plant life expectancy. So what we're talking about here is the actual cabbage of the palm, where they're actually trimming too close. And as you can see, here's an example of palms that have been basically shaved or pruned too close to the trunk on the petiole. This is going to allow that entry for that disease or insect problems. One of the things that I like to recommend to a lot of the tree companies that I work with is to go ahead and check out the University of Florida guidelines on pruning palms put out by Dr. Broshot. And I've gone ahead and put that in the chat here so that you can reference that. That's a great guideline on pruning palms and goes into a lot more specifics than what we can go into in this seminar here. So what do we want to do when we're pruning a palm? First, your climber is going to want to secure himself either in an aerial lift of some sort or using an SRT system, like I said, with a basal anchor is one of the better ways of ascending into a palm. You go up, ideally you want to be above the area that you're actually kind of cutting and work your way down. Oftentimes in practice it can be a little difficult, and so typically what climbers will end up doing is they'll go up and they'll end up removing all the dead fronds, then remove the layer of living fronds, and then oftentimes that's done using a chainsaw, which is fine. What I do recommend is when it gets into the seed pods and removing the fruit and the seed pods, it's best to use a handsaw for that. Oftentimes on the Sago palms that we see, the seed pods are actually emerging out from up above where the cabbage has all the fronds. So what you have to do is basically stick the handsaw in at an angle and actually cut that seed pod and reach up and pull that seed pod out of the palm. You know, it's important that when you're doing that, you're not going in and actually damaging the other existing fronds and just cutting that seed pod itself. A lot of times this is why we see palms that are hurricane pruned, is because the climbers go up, they're trimming the palm and they're cutting all this and they need to get the seed pods out, but they want to use the chainsaw. So the only way of really effectively doing that is to cut the other fronds that are in the way, because you can't typically fit a chainsaw blade in between the fronds and cut the seed pod at the same time. So some other considerations the climber needs to make is, number one, what's underneath that palm? Palm trees are surprisingly heavy. When you look at the palm, it doesn't look like much, but when you actually start cutting out those fronds can weigh anywhere from 5 to 60 pounds, depending on the species that you're pruning. So a good rule of thumb is, unless you have a clear drop zone, is go ahead and make sure that you're just removing them individually using a handsaw or chainsaw and tossing them down in a controlled fashion. If you have objects underneath. Obviously, you can lower those down, but that becomes much more time consuming. The other interesting thing that climbers need to be aware of is that palms, because they are living all the way through, when you're removing a palm tree, you need to follow through with that cut, because what ends up happening is that as you're cutting, the palm actually closes that gap, that kerf in the chainsaw. So it's very difficult to make a break cut in a palm tree. Typically, the best way to do it is cut pretty much all the way through and then make a final little cut and try to snap that off. And generally, I would only recommend removing, very small sections, maybe 1 to 2 feet, if you're having to block it down. Like I said, palms are notoriously heavy. The tree trunks are just extremely heavy in comparison to many other species of trees. On the ground, obviously your crew on the ground needs to be aware of the drop zone. Palm pruning typically is a very fast process. Typically a palm can be pruned anywhere from 8 to about 20 minutes is the average time on palm pruning, depending on the skill level of the climber, the equipment that he's using, whether he's following the standards or not, also has an impact on that. If you're actually following the standards, that's going to typically increase the amount of time that's required to prune the palm. About the quickest that I've seen palm pruned is about 6 minutes. And on average, I like to say if you're doing a production operation with a bucket truck, you could probably average about 10 minutes pruning per palm. And then plus on top of that, you have the cleanup, which typically would be a 2-man crew doing the actual cleanup. Oftentimes you have a lot of seed pods underneath, and that can be very problematic. Trying to rake up all these tiny little seeds. The seeds on a cabbage palm are about the size of your fingertip, and they put out about 1,000 seed pods. So timing of palm pruning is very, very important. Typically in like the savanna area, we would typically target our palm pruning after May, typically beginning of June and July, depending on the year. Once the palms have actually flowered and the flowers are actually started to drop, that's the time to go ahead and begin to prune the palms. If you prune them early on in May and the seed pod, the actual flowers have not emerged and you're pruning those out, what will end up happening oftentimes is that the palm is going to put a second round of flowers out, and then you're going to have more seed pods being produced later on in the season. So you're just delaying that problem. So palm pruning definitely is something that needs to be timed correctly in order to get it right. A lot of times clients will call over the winter when they're down visiting the area or what have you, and they see all these dead fronds and they want them cleaned up. My advice is to go ahead and explain to the client that the best time of the year is after the palms have actually flowered, before the fruit has set, and then go in and clean up the palms. Otherwise, you're going to be back pruning the palms a second time, particularly if there's a pool or pool decks, things like that, where we commonly will see palms being planted. Then you can actually have some slip and fall issues underneath. So back to the groundman. The best way that a groundman can effectively manage the palms is to actually take the fronds and stack them crisscrossed, and then they can pick them up in the middle. If you just try to lump them all together in a bunch, typically that's very, very cumbersome. Typically, if you stack them like this, you can pick them up in the middle, throw them on your shoulder, and walk it out to the truck. So another important thing to really consider when working with palms is the debris itself. Palms don't chip very well, and typically, arborists working in the coastal markets probably already know this. Most customers don't want mulch that has palm debris in them. So I found that as a best practice, one of the things to do is really, again, timing your palm pruning. When you time your palm pruning to a set season, say June, July, and August, you have some control over what kind of debris is actually going into the truck so that you can separate your load. Typically what we would do is, if we know that we're doing a bunch of palms on one day, that would get dumped off in one area, and then when we're chipping oak or maple, something else, that load of chips would be separate from that. You can mix the loads, but it's not something that you're going to want to turn around and give to a client. Even a lot of the facilities don't even really want palms. And the reason for that is pretty simple. You can't even burn the palms, because if you burn them, these little fronds basically ignite and burn, and then they'll get airborne and be floating through the air. So palm debris can be pretty difficult to manage. And then on top of that, with a chipper, chippers don't like palms. Like I said before, when your climber is cutting through the whole palm, if he's removing it, it's going to close up that curve in the palm. The same thing holds true when you're chipping. If you're chipping the palm fronds, you have to control the feed wheels, because it will definitely clog up your chipper. That's happened to me many times over the years. And particularly if you're chipping up a palm log, which I don't recommend, you're going to want to feed that thing very slowly and make sure that all that debris is actually coming out the chute. The crew needs to be very observant and monitor what's going in and what's coming out of the chute, because you can very quickly jam up your chipper with palm fronds and particularly palm logs. Typically what we would do is we would actually take the logs when we have those and set them off to the side, and then throw them on a log truck and haul them away and have them disposed of separately. Okay, now that we have talked about what a palm is and how to work on a palm, we need to talk a little bit about some of the problems that palms may have. One of the things that I have picked up over the years is the disorders and diseases of ornamental palms. That's put out by the University of Florida Extension. This is a little 2-ring binder with pictures of all the different disorders and diseases of ornamental palms. And this is a great field reference guide that can be used. Another good tool is just your regular old book. Right here I have Betrock's Cultivated Palms of the World. There's several different versions. There's also one on cold hardy palms. These are great reference books to have when you're working with palms. And particularly, in the southern part of the state and the coastal regions, having some of this stuff available would be very good. Also, I highly recommend going to the University of Florida and checking out some of their stuff that they have on their website regarding palms. They have different articles talking about palm pruning, different palm diseases, specific palm diseases, disorders, and everything that you need to know really about palms can be found on the University of Florida Extension website. It's a great resource, and I check it out on a regular basis for any kind of reference that I need in my practice. So when we talk about some of the problems that palms have, some of the biggest problems that we see in the landscape are actually nutrient deficiencies. Palms are very prone for nutrient deficiencies. This is often caused by either underwatering or overwatering. I see in many cases where palms are constantly being irrigated. And while it's important to irrigate them when they're newly transplanted, over time that amount of water definitely needs to be decreased so that the plant's actually not sitting in a pot of water. I've actually seen that on many sites. Your nutrients available to the plant are also very important. Palms, because they're more closely related to a grass than a tree, have a pretty high demand as far as nutrients. Some of the common nutrient deficiencies that we see are potassium, manganese, magnesium, even sometimes boron can be deficient in palms. Zinc is another common one that we see here in southern Florida. So overall, that's one of the biggest problems that we see with palms, is these nutrient deficiencies. And a lot of times that can be alleviated by proper fertilization. The University of Florida recommends for soils down here in Florida fertilization 4 times a year. Now, in Georgia, South Carolina, probably twice a year would be adequate, but definitely, 4 times a year would definitely be more beneficial. And the key also behind this is not over pruning. One of the things that many people don't understand about palms is that the palms actually take the nutrients from the older, lower fronds and translocate that to the new growth. So what ends up happening is if a palm tree is consistently hurricane pruned or over pruned, a lot of those nutrients that are in those green fronds or even yellowing fronds aren't able to translocate to the new growth. So it just creates this cycle where the palm over time continues to have less and less available nutrients, even sometimes if it's being properly fertilized. Aside from nutrient issues, there are a number of other insect and disease issues that we should be concerned about with palms. Some of the common ones that we see here are your palm leaf skeletonizer, which is caused by an insect that's actually feeding in between the veins of the palm. It's really more causing aesthetic damage to the palm itself. It's not something that generally that I would recommend treating. The next thing that a lot of clients get concerned about is this graphical leaf spot or a false smut of palm. And again, that's really more of a cosmetic sort of an issue where it's not something that we would recommend normally treating for most clients. Then we start to get into some of the more serious issues that we see on occasion, which is more like a bud rot of palm. As you can see in this illustration here, your terminal spike has been basically destroyed. Once you lose that center spike on any palm, the palm is done. It always is growing from that apical stem, and if that gets damaged or lost, then the palm is just going to die. More importantly is Ganoderma butt rot of palms. This can become a very serious issue. Number one, this is something that is spread in the soil. So if you're going to remove and replace it with another palm, you actually need to remove the soil as well. But more importantly, this butt rot can actually cause that palm to become a potential hazard for a climber or for a client. So definitely doing proper inspections, looking for any kind of butt rot on a palm is very, very important, particularly as part of a pre-climbing inspection. Next, we get into some of the little bit more exotic problems that we see, and primarily like lethal yellowing here is an issue primarily in Florida. However, it could be a concern in the southern parts of Georgia as well. Again, this is a fatal disease of palms. That's why they call it lethal yellowing. Then we get into your lethal bronzing disease of palms. What's important about lethal bronzing disease is that it affects a number of different species, including our native sable palmettos, our cabbage palms. So that is very, very important, again, because it's going to cause the palms to die. And there's not really effective treatments once the plant has been infected. This is actually caused by a phytoplasma, and it's spread by an insect vector. And so that's very critical. Once the palm has it, it's going to die, and there's a good likelihood that it could spread to other palms as well via the vector. Some of the most recent research done by Dr. Bader out of the University of Florida has really shown that addressing the vector issue is one of the better approaches. You can do some preventative treatments using antibiotics. However, long term, that's not necessarily the best avenue to approach it. Generally, a combination of antibiotics along with monitoring for the vector would be a much more viable long-term approach. As you can see, the distribution here of lethal bronzing disease, from 2008 when it was identified in Florida, and then it's pretty much moved throughout the entire lower half of the state, but we're also seeing it up by Jacksonville and up by Tallahassee, so right across the border from Georgia. So I wouldn't be surprised if we are seeing some actual lethal bronzing, particularly on your cabbage palmettos in southern parts of Georgia, possibly even up the East Coast into the Savannah and Charleston region even. One of the things that's important in my practice is actually assessing the overall health of palm trees when I'm out on the site. So I have the ability to use the Florida grades and standards for nursery stock as one potential option, and that works very well for plants that particularly are younger or smaller. But sometimes when we get some of these larger palms, 30 feet tall and such, we have to kind of assess that. So based on some of the work that Dr. Jerry Bond has done with urban tree health in his book on that, a lot of that has actually been adapted. So Dr. Kozer and some of the team down here in Florida have actually developed some guidelines, as you can see here on these next couple of slides, that kind of detail, how to assess the overall health of palms. For palms in Georgia, typically it's going to be the bottom two slides here, your sable palmetto and your Washingtonia robusta species that we're going to be most concerned with. as far as assessing their overall health. And this can be a very good guideline when you're assessing health. So if you're not familiar with Dr. Bond's work on urban tree health, I would definitely recommend getting that book and reading through that, and then also finding some of the research that Dr. Kozer and his team has put together down here in Florida, specifically relating to assessing the overall health of palms. Okay, just to summarize things, we've talked about what a palm is and also what a palm is not. We know that a Sago palm is not actually a palm. There's many different species of palms, but there's 14 native species to the United States. We've also discussed how to properly prune a palm. We've talked about the best management practices as well as the Z133 standards, and the importance of why that should be followed should be pretty apparent. We've also discussed, some of the common problems associated with palms that we're seeing here in the Southeast. I'd like to thank the Georgia Arborist Association for having me today to present this seminar on palms. I hope that it's been informative and educational and everybody enjoyed the presentation. Who would have known that there was so much to know about palms? Thank you very much and have a great evening.